And now we're going into this week. I forgot to change the label there. We are going into week 8, case law. But last week, a lot of us were traveling and not available, and we missed what is sort of the core, the crux of this whole book, which is the giving of the Ten Commandments, or the Torah, which it later would become to be expanded to be understood as. And Shay did a beautiful, beautiful job with that. And rather than us miss that, I've asked him to give us sort of a recap and take us through some of the highlights of what they talked about last week. It was a beautiful discussion, but I don't want any of us to miss it. So I'm going to let Shay kind of take this and run with it after we talk about what's in this lesson, because in this lesson, we're going to be talking about what's called the Book of the Covenant. And there's this wonderful quote that I'll put in your back pocket because it kind of ties everything together. Brueggemann says that this is really this Book of Covenant that shows up right after the Ten Commandments is sort of the earliest example of the overall books of the law, the Torah, where the older commands are endlessly reiterated. He says, and exposited or explained and gone over and over and over again, or transposed to meet new circumstances. And this is part of the tradition that we have inherited as Christians who are descended from the Judaic faith. We are folks who constantly go back and look at it again, and go back and look at it again, and reinterpret it again in new circumstances. That's why folks that want to keep scripture carved in stone and say, if that's what it says, it means everything today that it meant back then. And this very next passage that we get is demonstrably says, no, that's not really the way this works. You are always looking at the things and figuring out how to interpret it, how to expand upon it, how to move it and take the principles and apply them in other ways. And so that's kind of the spirit of tonight's lesson. And so I'm going to turn it now over to Shay and let him kind of get us caught up all together, and then we'll move from there.
Of course. Well, hope you all had a great week. I very much enjoyed last week getting to teach from Wilmington, North Carolina, and had some friends in the other room, and they were listening to a little bit and the laughing and all of that, which is funny because they grew up Church of God. And so they would, I think they would be very much intrigued by what we do at Gather. And I told them a little bit about it. So I will be brief for those of you that had to listen to me talk last week, but I just want to say from the outset tonight that this Decalogue, or 10 Commandments, or 10 sayings, or 10 words, depending how you translate it, it actually appears twice. So I just want to say that as sort of as a caveat, that here we have it, and we're in Exodus, but it also appears in Deuteronomy, and we're not exactly sure what came first. And so, but as we alluded to last week with Buber, this is the climax of the entire book. You know, the people have come out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, as God reminds in a second here. And this is the climax. You know, what now? This is the ultimate challenge of theology. That is, okay, what do we do now? And so everything's been building to this moment. You know, don't mess it up, Moses. But fortunately, Moses has some help from God, from Yahweh. And so everything from this moment on will change. And it begins with Yahweh reminding the people of what the Lord has done. And I need to say here that we're approaching this with different lenses. I am Christian-ish, and so I confess and I acknowledge that this part of the Decalogue, as well as the whole Hebrew Bible, belongs solely to the Jewish people, and I also include it as part of my tradition. And so I just want to say that because in verse 2, that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, as I just said, the Jewish community, or some parts of the Jewish community, consider this, while this doesn't necessarily have a command, they actually consider this proclamation as part of the 10 sayings. So I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. This is actually the saying on which all of the subsequent sayings rely or depend. Because of what God has done, Yahweh can now establish this covenant, this treaty, because of what God has done in history, acting on the behalf of the people. So we have 10 sayings or 10 words, and I didn't make anyone last week try to recite them all. But together in a room, I would have a whiteboard and I would say, all right, all right, what we got? Who can remember some of these? And of course, father, mother would probably be easy. Something about an idol, can't say God. But I just want to speak briefly to each of these because it's important. The first 4 sayings are conditional, meaning they have a reason explaining them. I'm not going to read them to you, but the first one is, you shall have no other gods before me, because, or for. And this is important because for the people, there's no reason to worship God out of fear or out of dread, like other people worship present tense, their God. Rather, as Yahweh just said, that this is the God who's brought them out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, that's actually the reason that they are to have no other gods before this God, Yahweh Eloheinu, the Lord your God. And so it's actually out of a sense of love and of gratitude, and not of fear or dread, or even sort of the obligation, right? So that's important that comes first, because it's building on that acknowledgement that the Lord your God has done this for you. And Tim, feel free to jump in at any point. You shall not make for yourself an idol. And last week, I'm not going to broach it tonight, but I did talk about how we continue to talk about God as elemental. But what's interesting about this story is that God is also trans-elemental, that God can control when God is in or above the elements, not just so it's interesting that God can control the elements. Therefore, God cannot really be pinned down to a certain image. And that's important because an idol essentially is a static image. It's an image we get attached to. And I was just on a Facebook conversation before Gather, and I used a Bishop Yvette Flunder's word, biblio-idolatry. And because we talked about who or what is the word of God, and I was being cheeky, but the answer is, you're the word of God, which I'm sure people will stone me later for. But it's really important that we know that this Yahweh sort of refuses to be pinned down by any image, or as we see, any language. I will be who I will be, or I will be wherever I will be. I will be in a bush. I will be on the mountain. I will be in the wind. And yet at the same time, I don't have to be in these things. And so God is differentiating God's self from all the other gods that were primarily imaged in a particular way. So that's the importance of idol, of making idols and images of God. The third thing, we spent some time, because I don't know about you, but I grew up thinking I couldn't say, oh my God, or GD or whatever. But this is actually a really poor translation of this saying. Should not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. In other words, you shall not take up the name of the Lord your God, Martin Buber says, for unreality, or in general for any worthless practice. Now, when we take this verse or this saying in that context, it kind of exposes a lot of our piety. It exposes a lot of the problems of religion today. I would say a lot of the problems of religion today are that we've put God's name co-signed on a lot of things that are not godly. In fact, are ungodly or anti-Christ, if you're Christian. And so this verse is really about not taking Yahweh and taking that name lightly enough to apply it to any worthless or selfish practice. Okay. So that's what it means to take God's name in vain. It's not saying, oh my God. So you have to say, oh my gosh, or oh my G, or whatever.
Yeah.
But this is actually applying and putting God's name to something that ultimately is an unreality, or is in fact a worthless practice. Tim,
Can you give us an example?
I'm about to do that.
I don't quite understand.
Go ahead.
Maybe the greatest example, the first one that always comes to mind with this, are people that fight wars in the name of God, right? This is God's on our side. Let's go kill everybody. That's a problem. There's a problem there, because in these 10 same sayings, it's you shall not kill. And yet there's no such thing as a holy war, but people will try to make a holy war fighting in the name of God. That's what the conquests were all about, right? Our God is right. We're going to go kill the God of the Muslims. We're going to go kill, that's the idea. I think that a lot of this so-called evangelism that's going in and is creating these big wealthy mega churches in very, very poor African communities and teaching them a lot of wrong doctrine, homophobia and violence against women, that is another way of making wrongful use of the name of God. I would say that a lot of people who say God bless America as a way of just trying to anneal an audience to their political cause would be using that. So those are like the grand scale. But I also know folks that will call me up in a minute and tell me that God told them something. And I know God didn't tell them because they're off on every which kind of way, right? So there are people that will also try to use or speak for God wrongfully as a way of manipulating folks, right? I fear God. I would fear God if I were you. The Lord, you got hell is hot. God's gonna get you. All that stuff is that way of trying to use the name of God for leverage. And that's right. Yeah, Chris talked about, the idea of prosperity gospels. God will bless you if you just, give this little. And you see, I sort of miss, they're not on television as much as they used to be, because when I couldn't sleep, they were sort of entertaining those. If you send in, maybe they're still on in other places. They don't get a lot of airtime in Chicago, but you send a seed offering of $100, and before you know it, you're going to be driving a Cadillac because God told me, God spoke to me. That's where this space is. Does that help you, Jeff?
Yeah. How did it wind up being the GD idea?
I think it's because a lot of people that had not taken time to read or study, right? You have to remember that a lot of the stuff that has been handed down to us, a lot of stuff that's been handed down to us, particularly those of us that come from deep sort of Pentecostal evangelical traditions. Remember that the people that set those doctrines in motion were self-taught and would read something and make up their mind what that would be without the broader understanding of the context of what these things were about. So they never thought to check what the rabbis said. They never thought to think about, go and do all what rabbis do, which is read over here, now read over there, and pull all this thing together. They would look at this, and that's what it must mean.
Yeah, I think I was taught the frivolous use of calling on the name of God.
Which is exactly right. That's exactly what this is. You can't just call on, but see, a lot of people will call on God frivolously to excuse themselves or to manipulate others or to.
You're saying actually misrepresenting.
Yes.
The purpose of God. God's purpose.
I don't know that even if you say, "Oh my God," you could make the case that that's not even a capital G God that you're saying, right? Just "Oh my God."
True, right.
So I think that's a semantic issue that is not at all in the spirit or in the intent of this particular.
Interesting. I've never heard this argument. So interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think there's a control element as well of from kind of historic kind of church patriarchy of telling people what they can and can't do, and that "oh my God" kind of thing is part of that controlling a population.
Yeah. Lisa, so it's interesting because we talked about this Thursday night, and then on Friday, Lisa tagged me in something, and Lisa, it's escaping me. Do you remember what the post said?
It was kind of a meme, but her point was about how angry she gets when she hears the Lord using the Lord's name in vain, thinking it means swearing when it means, I don't remember the specifics, but the things that we had talked about.
I'll have to go back and find it.
I'm gonna find it. I'll find it, Shay.
I remember I laughed, and it was just really interesting that we had just talked about this the night before.
Yeah, I think God is a pretty tough guy. He can take a lot. He or she can take a lot, and I don't think really is hurt by somebody frivolously saying GD. I think that's not cool to say, but I think God can take it. God's not that wimpy, but definitely God doesn't want his or her name being used for profit, for false, for misleading people, for
taking other lives.
I think I've always felt like it was misrepresented. Like I don't think that's what they're talking about, or what the commandment really means. Just simply GD. Come on.
We couldn't say hell either.
Yeah, that's why you said heck, right?
Yes, but one time I said heck, which I thought was fine, and a nun, she yelled at me, and I couldn't understand why, because even my
Yeah.
parents who were
It's
I found it.
it's
Shay.
it's control. It's a type of control. Yeah.
What's it
Say
say?
it was, I can't believe I grew up thinking using God's name in vain was saying, oh my God, and not using God to manipulate people and advance your own personal agenda.
Yep. Yep.
That's pretty much it. So
Quite spot on.
In
Yeah.
vain, right? To use it for a vain cause, for something that is for your own benefit, whether you are funding the military industrial complex and you're a politician that wants to make sure all your buddies at Halliburton make money, which is one of the big causes of war, or whether it is you want everybody to give in the offering so you become a rich preacher, get your own jet. There's all those things. And we're using these big epic versions, but people also do it around a dinner table, right? And so that's kind of what it is. Yeah, I grew up, I couldn't say gosh or gee or heck even, Mary, because my parents said, you're just using that because you really want to say the other and you shouldn't be thinking that way at all. And I'd get smacked for all of it. I got smacked for everything though. So.
Yep. All right, let's keep moving. Just because I want to give Tim time to come on the other side and help us through I think chapter 21 tonight. So Kasuda argues that this next, the fourth saying, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For him, he believes that this is exalted. This is really, really important. Okay. And the Sabbath is holy, meaning it's exalted over the other 6 days, because in practicing it, you are revealing the primary purpose of saying or attesting that Yahweh is the creator of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So by stopping and resting and not working, you are actually becoming like God.
Yes.
And you are recognizing God as the supreme creator of the world, who God's self rested.
Right.
So that's how we keep it holy that day. And at the same time, it gives us sort of a humility that our work is not that important.
Well, I mean, it goes back to the manna, right? You're not going to get manna on the Sabbath because God is closed. That God is closed. There's no manna on Sunday because our Sabbath. Yeah, which is Saturday actually. God is closed on Saturday. So no point you doing anything because there's nothing to do. And that's what keeps it holy. The Sabbath is really about God's rest.
Yes.
And because God is resting, we must rest, because there's no point doing anything if God's not in the middle of it.
In fact, I would argue that coming right after the, using God's name or in a in a vain or in an unreality or a worthless practice, Sabbath, we can see why Jesus got in trouble, right?
Mm-hmm.
For doing things on the Sabbath. And I don't want to open that can of worms, but I just want to say that the Sabbath is really, really important. And, that day is to be exalted over the other 6. And that's how we keep it holy. That's how we enter God's rest. It's because God rested, we can rest. Okay.
Yeah.
Number 5, honor your father and mother so that, your days might be long. My parents used to always tell that joke that, that the so your days may be long is, because I brought you in this world and I'll take you out kind of thing. But really here, what we have, it's kind of measure for measure. If you honor the one who's the source of your life, you will be, vouchsafed long life upon the earth. And it's a little superstitious, but at the same time, there's something to be said about honoring a source of life and honoring life so that more life may come from it. So I think it's actually, it's definitely been used in a very similar way as number 3 for me. I don't know about y'all, but like if I back talk my mom, especially and had a "oh my God" in it, man.
Oh dear.
Oh man, that was I would get wrecked real fast. So
the honoring your father and your mother, though, is also the idea that what has been invested in you, the work that you are sort of the reward of their labor. It is sort of the ideal version of this. I want to point out one thing, and it comes up later in the case law that we'll look at later tonight. This is a big departure. The radical piece of this is not about honoring parents, but the fact that the mother is included here.
Mhm.
In the ancient codes, it was all patriarchy, and the fact that they are introducing, even though they remain a patriarchal society, they include the mother here is and the fact that motherhood was a cherished state in the Israelite mindset. The fact that the mother's there it's a radical move. It's a big move for them.
Uh-huh. So here we get into the second half, and these are whereas the first four have some reasons or some some conditional statements. These are completely these are pretty much prohibitions without explanation, okay? And it's likely because no organized community or society would be able to exist if everyone just wantonly disregarded these rules. Okay, so there is no because to thou shalt not kill. But what's interesting, and I think it's worth thinking and talking about, is that Buber is really interested, and he's curious why these 10 sayings really falls under what he calls the domain of cult, that there's nothing more than the prohibition of the false. There's not actually the prescription of correct deeds, and there's no circumcision. There's Sabbath observance, but there's no Passover. And so I just want to kind of, as I talk about these last couple and hand it off to Tim, I just want to say that let's keep in the front or back of our minds, depending where you need to keep it for a later conversation, about how and why these were written, from when they're written, and what's going on in the community, an exilic community that's living in exile, and writing about origins and looking back, why certain things are here, why certain things are missing, and why it might have been important for them to just write down some general absolute prohibitions without offering any explanation for those reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Because, spoiler alert, you shall not kill is here, but it isn't much longer until the people write that God commands when Joshua comes around to go and kill a bunch of people and take their land. So I'm just going to put that in your hat for a later conversation. These are very nuanced and complicated documents, okay? Living histories. So number 6, you shall not kill. Number 7, you shall not commit adultery. Number 8, you shall not steal. Number 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And then finally, you shall not covet. And the context here is anything that belongs to your neighbor, including your wife. Okay, so that's sort of implied in here. And what's interesting is what these writers, meaning Buber and Cassuto, are saying that implied in like neighbor is this notion of the stranger, meaning anyone in the land. So neighbor, not just as like, oh, hey, Mr. Ross, my next door neighbor, I see you watering your plants over there, but it's also the people you don't know that live within the land. And in that way, the circle's actually much wider. The target's much broader. When we think of the neighbor as even the strangers to us that live in our land, perhaps the aliens that have come from other places, aliens meaning from other countries, not from outer space, although maybe one day we'll have a conversation about aliens from outer space and how we're to love them like God and ourselves. But for now, we'll just keep it with the strangers living in our land. And this is really concerned with more general principles rather than particular instances. There are no, well, what if my, there's none of that. It's just, you shall not.
Yep.
You shall not. And it's kind of like in Jesus saying, you shall love your neighbor. And you've seen the meme. It's like, but my neighbor's Muslim, Jesus. And I'm just assuming that's a Southern person saying that. But like, and then the meme, Jesus is like, yes, even your stupid neighbor or whatever. So, so I just love that though, because it's really like, there's a hard stop here, even though I have a semicolon. You shall not kill, period, which I think would challenge us in our ways in which we use God's name for war and for gain and for colonialism and all these things, adultery, stealing. So all of these things, it's actually quite a high bar here.
Mm-hmm.
so while all people acknowledge that these things are bad, in even in those days, right? Killing, adultery, stealing. Number 9 moves us into matters of the heart. Okay, it's not just about what you do, but like in bearing false witness and then coveting. We're really starting to get to how we're motivated, because coveting is a weird word that's kind of slippery, but really it's just desiring someone else's property, yearning for something that isn't yours, or even being envious of others for what they have. And I love that it's aimed at the state of mind and not necessarily at action. And I think that's because, let's be honest, the two are connected, right? Like out of a heart, the mouth speaks. And I also think Jesus comes along and says, hey, you've heard it said, but I tell you. Jesus is also getting at the heart, because just because we don't harm someone right now, if we harbor harmful thoughts against them, I think it's likely that in the future, I'm going to violate our covenant in our community in one way or the other. I may not kill you, but I may lie or just start a rumor about you or be envious of you and treat you differently. So really, I love how it kind of ends with this, in the Decalogue itself ends with the words your neighbor, which forms a really interesting parallel with I'm the Lord your God, and it ends with your neighbor, your God, your neighbor, your God, your neighbor. In other words, covenant is always a communal thing. It always has communal consequences or ramifications. I mean, my God, sorry, don't stone me. We're seeing that right now, with COVID cases going up, and people not wanting to be vaccinated. I just today canceled a worship night I was planning with my parents because they have decided that they're now anti-vax. And so I had to let them know I would play if they would all wear masks, or show documentation. And of course, they're not going to do it. But I would argue that you can't love your neighbor well and not want to be vaccinated, or at least take the right precautions to protect them from risk of disease, and harm and possibly death. So I just want to contextualize that in our current moment, as cases are upticking and as people are starting to freak out again. I just want to name that these thousands of years later, I don't think we've really gotten the love of neighbor thing exactly right.
No.
Unless they think it's a hoax.
Sure.
Unless they believe it's a hoax. In other words,
a lot of them say they believe it's a hoax, and they probably do believe it.
But belief is always a matter of choice. You've been presented something, you've been told something, right? You know,
right.
There is that scripture that, you know, where I'm trying to pull it out. It's like, you are without excuse. One scripture says, you've been shown this. You have been shown. There's no contradicting what you're seeing, and yet you've decided to go this way. There is the fact that what's happening right now with the Delta and who it's affecting and who are getting slammed are the unvaccinated. Yes, there are breakthroughs, but if you do the math, 161 million vaccinated people, 10,000 breakthroughs, that's not even significant in terms of science. That's not even significant. We knew that's where they said it was a 97% effective rate, right? So we're living up to the math. The problem is whenever folks are deciding that, well, I'm not going to do this for a bunch of lies, a bunch of reasons, a bunch of talk, you know, Tucker Carlson nonsense. And in the middle of it, they're choosing to believe that. They're without excuse. It's just that simple. And they are not, they're violating about every one of these except maybe adultery. And if you really twisted this text, you might get into it, but they are killing, they are stealing the welfare and the health of other people. They are bearing false witness by perpetuating these lies. And in the process, you know, I could make a case that they are also coveting a certain kind of status in their community and trying to create a false sense of themselves in many kinds of ways. But anyway.
But that's your belief.
That's exactly right. And
they believe differently, because my family is in that stuff, and I don't think they want to kill anybody.
You know,
intentionally, you know what I'm saying? That's not their plan.
It's not their
They
intention.
think it's a hoax. They
But
think a lot of people think it's a
it's
hoax.
negligence.
It's terrible, but they do.
Yeah, but okay, I guess. But I think that Tim's point is, you know, you choose deliberately to not educate yourself. I mean, you choose to defy the
They've
evidence.
educated themselves with Fox News.
Right.
Yeah. All of whom, every single anchor has received the vaccination,
Isn't
right?
that the
So,
truth? Isn't that the truth?
And you
But if-
can't, yes, and you can't enter the Fox workplace. The only way you can wear a mask is if you prove you're double vaxxed. You literally have to get a clearance, and that's on to get into the building without a mask. You have to have clearance.
we had this discussion on Nextdoor, fight on Nextdoor. But it's always you're a sheep. You know, all you people are sheep believing the government that's out to kill you,
Right,
and we're
right.
sheep, we're sheep, we're sheep. And then someone wrote, interestingly though, there are always good Christians who say the Lord is their shepherd, right?
Right. Right.
Sheep,
Right.
sheep, sheep,
Yeah.
sheep.
It just seemed to me, I just want to be careful about not judging somebody who is thinking differently than I am and saying that they're breaking a certain commandment. It's just, I kind of heard that.
I probably said that, but what I'm saying is that these are people that claim to know this text, and then yet that has not entered this conversation with them. The fact that they're endangering other lives, that they are putting themselves at risk, and whether or not they believe that, the evidence has been everywhere that would suggest that the vaccine works. We are living proof the vaccine works. So, you know, let's not in our willingness to want to be
Doesn't sin
gentle.
have to be intentional, I think?
Well,
I mean, I would say at this point, if you are misinformed or disinformed, it's not because you don't have agency. I mean, I really,
yeah.
I understand it's been overly politicized, or politicized. I don't know about overly, but there's so many things we can disagree about. Like with my parents, you know, and I've told them this. There's so many things we could disagree about. We could even disagree about vaccines in the abstract. But like at this point, we've had enough conversations. I've sent you enough stuff. The data are suggesting like the risks of the vaccine are nothing compared to the risk of dying in a hospital. And both my parents had severe COVID, and their answer isn't, I don't believe the vaccine doesn't work. Their answer was, well, God will protect me. And I'm like,
Yeah, my mother's as well. Right.
and I'm like, okay. And I sent my mom this thing of this worship leader guy from Hillsong, and he's taking pictures of him right before he's being intubated. And he's all, the Lord is my healer and all this stuff. And guess what, bro? Vaccine could have been your healing. Could have been your healing.
What did they say to that? Yeah, that's like the person on the roof waiting for God to come, right?
Right.
Yeah.
A lifeboat. I said a lifeboat 3 times.
Your back, you know, send me a sign, God, send me a sign.
Right,
and so
you
it's
know.
really unfortunate. But Jeff, to your point, I'm not going to call it. I mean, sin we need to redefine anyway. Sin is really just missing the mark or falling short of a commitment. And I would say if we're disinformed, misinformed, and our disagreements leads us to endanger other people. But at this, you know, it's tricky because at this point, most people have access to a vaccine. So like, I'm not worried about getting COVID from my parents. I'm more worried about them getting COVID. But you know, people that continue to go out and spread it and don't care. I mean, there has to be some type of social responsibility for what's going on. And I don't know the answer to that, but I know that it's dangerous and it's
And so maybe let me massage my point. I would think that those that are perpetrating a message, an anti-vax message, particularly preachers who are preaching against it and everything, are not paying attention to what these laws say. What these laws say, because they are actually doing what the evidence has shown. I mean, everybody, this is not like it's a secret over here. You know, they are, you have to, I just really go back to you're inexcusable. If you have looked at this, if you've been taught, and if you've been told time and time again, and then you get up and tell your people, we don't want to do this, we're going to trust God. It's like snake handlers. You know, are pastors responsible? They put poisonous snakes in people's hands, they get bit, they die. Who's responsible there? Oh, you know, but always in these circles, then you blame the victim, don't you? The person The person who gets COVID didn't have enough faith to trust God to not get
Yes.
COVID.
That's unbelievable. So that's what they say about the millions of humans that have been killed by this disease.
Right.
Is this their fault because they didn't believe in God enough
Didn't have enough faith.
Didn't have enough faith.
that God won't kill them? So God went and killed them.
Well, some killed them.
What kind
They
of
haven't
God
worked.
is
They
that?
haven't worked all that out.
There's a lot of that. Yeah.
That's so
I don't want
fascist.
that God.
I don't believe in that God.
That's
Anyways,
not my am.
so there are three dimensions of this community. Being in relationship with God, the terms of the covenant are when we're in relationship with God, we're also in relationship with one another. And there's really, those are really important to keep in mind. So
Shane, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, can I interrupt one more time? Just back to Facebook and something that
Yeah.
you posted on Facebook, I don't know, a few weeks ago,
yes.
about people that say that they have a personal relationship with God
Oh yeah.
and how you sort of objected to that. I think in a very poignant way, it's what you're talking about right now.
Yeah, I mean, what happens, I think, is if I just focus on my personal relationship with God, I can just do whatever I want, without worrying about the social ills and responsibilities that I may or should be caring about. But if all I do is focus on like my quiet time and highlighting my Bible and taking a selfie on Instagram and posting my daily scripture and praying and feeling really bad and then feeling really good and then just living my life, personal relationships kind of become like a euphemism for just being a lazy Christian. But I believe in a personal relationship. But like I'm saying right here, the relationship is always with community. So like my relationship to God should never be separated from my relationship with the people around me, because I'm just very much a Trinitarian person that I believe like God, myself, and my neighbor. And that like at any point, if something goes wrong between the three, then like something's off and we need to revisit. And I think really what we have is just a lot of like vertical stuff, just God and the people.
God and me.
It's God and me.
God and me. We make a majority. Yeah.
So basically the covenant here, the Decalogue is modeling what the people are to be like themselves. And keep in mind, Israel's coming to be, or at least this is the story of how Israel's coming to be. And so this is important, that they're partners in the covenant of the God, as Martin, or as I love that. It reminds me of Dr. Carroll, of a God.
God, there you go.
So the way, the 10 commandments aren't just so God doesn't get angry. The 10 commandments are so that we can live a life that honors God and honors one another. And so that's the covenant, and that's the terms of the deal. And then I love this Kasuda, and this is the last slide, I think, that this is the lofty ethical plane. And I love that because we have two joining planes. We have the religious and the ethical that are juxtaposed here. And if they are regarded in the connection, it will be observed that there are no such separate fields at all here, but only one as yet undifferentiated common life, which requires a constitution containing religious and ethical elements in order to achieve a uniform growth. That's Martin Buber. And Kasudo ties it back to the Abrahamic promise, and you will be blessed, all the families of the earth. And so the 10 commandments aren't meant to tell me what to do, but they're meant to actually enhance our life as a community and our mystical element of our elemental and trans-elemental God, the creator, the Yahweh.
So this sets me up, thank you, Chase, sets me up beautifully for what is commonly called the Book of the Covenant. We know that this is a later addition to the text. It's actually because it's written to a community that's not nomadic. If you look at all the law that comes down in these three chapters, there's a whole lot of farm talk going on. And so there is this idea that they went back and they looked at the Decalogue, these 10 laws, and they tried to begin to figure out how that would look in the real world, because they understood, as opposed to us with a legalistic mind, understanding the law means something like, do, don't, do's and don'ts. They see this as ethical guidelines, these sayings, these 10 words. And so it's just in the way that it's written and the way and the subject matter that it conforms to is written to a community, an agrarian community that is settled. And so they've sandwiched this sort of case law, which is called the Book of the Covenant, in between this Decalogue on chapter 20, where God says, these are sort of the 10 premises. These are the 10 principles that I want you to adhere to. And the covenant, because it's in chapter 24, next week's lesson, where they go up on the mountain, Aaron and the 70 elders, they all go up on the mountain and say, all right, we agree. So in between, they've sort of sandwiched this way of sort of anticipating what's going to happen whenever the covenant is fully entered into. So God brings, this is my proposition to you. I think it's Buber, it might be Kasuto, who says, this is a proposition that I'm going to propose to you. These are sort of the principles we want to follow in these commandments. And they're ethical mandates. They're not statutory laws. So this is, even though they call it the Book of the Covenant, it's not really a book, and neither was it, and sometimes it's called the Covenant Code. It's not even really a code, even though a lot of what we read is modeled on other legal codes, which I'm sure Lisa and those of us that took any law classes in college are aware of: the Babylonian code, the Assyrian codes, the Hammurabi, right, the Hittite codes. About the time that this is emerging in the Israelite narrative, there has already been established literally tens of thousands of legal codes in the surrounding area, and they've all sort of cross-pollinated. The big difference in what's happening in the book of Exodus from these other codes is that these are divinely ordained. All these other codes come from rulers, from monarchs, and there are two sort of things. There are the authorities and what's called accepted usage. We understand just naturally that this is the way we should behave. You know, the streets should be quiet at night. That just sort of is what happens. We understand these, and they sort of get enacted into laws. And then there are authorities, legislatures and monarchs who say, no, this is what you've got to do. But here, remember that God calls Moses on the mountain and hands him these principles. And throughout it starts, chapter 21 starts with God saying, and say to the Israelites this. And so what we've got in this book is something that is of divine origin, which is substantially different than a lot of the codes, even though scholars have made entire careers. God knows how many PhD dissertations have been written comparing ancient codes to what goes on both in the 10 Commandments and in these 3 chapters. There's a lot of good stuff here. We're going to do a lot of checklisting because it's too much. We could do 5 weeks on this, but I kind of want to just go through some of the stuff so you see how this kind of gets into application. The goal, though, go ahead, Shay, is to create an ethical community. Rabbi Kasuto says this: the sources of the official law were official law, meaning the laws of Israel that were on the books, not these 10 Commandments. They were secular statutes of the ruling authorities or monarchs and accepted usage or regular legal practice, whereas the Torah laws were regarded as religious and ethical requirements directed to the collective and individual conscience. What is in Exodus is not, it's not like you could go into court and say, this is Penal Code, chapter 23, verse 4. That's not what this is for. It's to say these are the governances of how we can be in community together. Torah seeks on many an occasion to go beyond strictly legal requirements and to grant a man, and this is the rabbi writing in the masculine, what is due him from the ethical viewpoint and from the aspect of the love a man should bear his fellow, who is his brother, since both have one heavenly parent or father. So the idea that's driving this is that we are all related. We all come from the same God. We all owe one another the same level of respect and care and concern. It is creating what will eventually become known as an ethical community. So let's go on, Shay. The end result, here we go. Thank you. I forgot I had this little bump here. The end result is what now a lot of times we hear called the beloved community. Have you all heard that phrase? The beloved community, the ethical community, the place where the brother is always the neighbor, the sister, the friend, the stranger in the community is always regarded on an even plane with your own interests, which is kind of the drumbeat underneath the back half of the Decalogue, right? So you got a bunch of cases then that starting in 21, it's just out the gate. And the first thing that they want to talk about is the Hebrew slave. Now, I said this very early on in the study of Exodus. Hebrew is different than Israelite. Hebrew comes from a word that actually sort of means alien or a stranger. So if there's anyone in this company, and this is one of the reasons why we know that this comes later, is because the children of Israel, there's no real record that through the Exodus coming out of Egypt that they were enslaved, there was enslavement going on here. This is for a later community where there is enslavement going on, but this is an alien, meaning of somebody who has no rights. And so there was, and they said, if you got a male slave, this male slave will be free after 6 years, unless he decides to stay with his family. If he has a wife and this wife bears children, the children, by the way that the whole indenture thing works, belongs to the master. And so their mother belongs to the master. And if the man wants to stay with his family, then he's brought before God. And the interesting term here, this God is not the God of Israel. This term here actually implies the idea that in a court, there was always in ancient courts, the gods of that particular culture or nation sat at the head of the court, and the judges always ruled on behalf of that God. So this means brought before God, brought into the courts, where he would say, I don't want to be free. And then they would pierce his ear. Buber's very interesting. He says that is a sign that he has surrendered his liberty. And so the idea is that he would do this out of love for his wife and children, that he would say, I don't want our family to be destroyed. I will choose to remain indentured here as a slave, and we will live as slaves together as a family. What's very interesting is female slaves have very special protected status, because they are in the reason why women are enslaved is to be concubines. And if someone acquires a female slave and she does not please the owner is compelled to return her to her family. He can't sell her off to somebody else. He can't make a profit on the fact that he's unhappy with this particular woman. If he decides that he's going to pass this female slave on to the son, she becomes his daughter, and she has all the rights of a natural born daughter to his family. She's no longer a slave. She is now the daughter. And either way, if she is there, she has, her care is of ultimate concern. So if, let's say that she is a concubine, and the person who has bought her and owns her takes another woman and says, I'm done, sort of done with you. I'm done with you, Lucy. I got Harriet here. Well, what that means is that Lucy still has to be fully provided for. Her care, her feeding, her clothing, everything has to be provided for. If any one of these requirements are not met according to the way that they are doing this, the woman is able to go free. Nobody has to pay for her. There's no ransom. There's no nothing. She's done. Wash your hands from it. I was in a place where I wasn't cared for. I'm done. I'm free. And the reason why these slave rules come to the top of all of this, as distasteful as it may be to us, what I'm really grateful for is that it's not like the women are just treated as property and dismissed. There is care and concern for the women here. And one of the reasons why there is this sort of work about justice, and we'll see this emerge over and over again for slaves, is that, again, we go back to, you came out of the house of slavery. You cannot treat, now I don't want to be very clear, slavery in biblical times is a little different than slavery in the American story. These people weren't captured and ripped out of their homelands and brought into chattel slavery. These people, quite often you become a slave because you're indebted to someone, or because you don't have the means to survive on your own, and the only way, your only survival is by bringing yourself and putting yourself in service in a household. Different kind of idea here. But you cannot, just because these people are fairly powerless economically and politically, does not give any slave owner in this, under this guise, under this code, the right to abuse their slaves or the right to deny them their own dignity. And so there's this idea that perpetuates itself throughout the history of ancient Israel. That's why even in the New Testament, we see the slaves of Jewish households coming into worship and being free to worship God and to follow Christ. Shay, let's move on, because this is all, stop me, you all. I'm just going to whip through some of this stuff if there's stuff that's confusing or interesting to you, because there's a lot in these chapters. The prevailing idea through all of the human interaction cases is that human life is sacred. And it not only encompasses the person who is wrong, but the life of the wrongdoer is always considered. And so for it to be a capital offense would mean that the crime has been so gross and so grievous that there is no, that sacredness has already been defiled. Intentionality is the big piece. This is a question that you had earlier, Jeff. Whether or not you intend to kill determines whether or not it's a capital offense. And that same idea pervades even through modern law to this day, right? If there violence and slander against parents for some reason is a capital offense, and no one seems to really understand why that is. But if you hit your parents, or if you say evil things about them, they say put them to death. And maybe it is that you're bringing such a shame on your family that your family is going to wind up being enslaved because of just the shame, or to use the Yiddish term, the shunda that you've put against the family will be so great that you've actually canceled why a family would want to perpetuate itself. That's a theory, but nobody really understands where that comes from. If it's injuries, the recompense for any injuries, physical injuries as a result of violence, is based on the loss of productivity. This is damages. We see this all the time in legal things. All of us that watch these legal shows, this is damages. And so the penalty is set according to damages. If you kill a slave, yours or someone else's, it's a capital offense. It doesn't matter that they're a slave. Their life still has dignity. Human life is still sacred. You do not get to say, well, that doesn't work. That just doesn't work. If you do violence against a pregnant woman and the fetus is lost, because that fetus, this is a very interesting thing for the right to life, folks, because that fetus is not yet a fully formed human being and has its own life, damages are paid. But if the mother dies, it's a capital offense. And this is where we get this famous thing that Jesus talks about. This is the first place where this emerges. This is common in almost all of the ancient law codes, however. They're just borrowing from the Babylonians and the Assyrians, the Hittites. They're borrowing the same language from these other cultures. A life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a bruise for a bruise, a wound for a wound. The idea is that the crime that's committed against an individual the penalty should be equitable. Now, what's very interesting is that we read Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you to love your enemies and do good to those that hate you, right? That's what Jesus says. Quite often the way that this got settled was not, oh, you poked my eye out, so now I get to poke your eye out. That's not the way that typically worked, because there was always an economic resolution to these things, a way of calculating damages. So if I took your eye out intentionally, or if I took it out even unintentionally, the fact that you've lost an eye will cost you something. What are those costs? I am now compelled to pay those costs. The only difference where this comes into play, and I love this, are when slaves lose eyes or teeth or get burned or bruised or any of these things happen to them. When that happens, if they are beaten and they suffer loss by what their owners have done to them, their masters have done to them, they are immediately freed. Why would you do that? That's unlike any other code of the period. It's not back that way in Hammurabi. It's not that way in the Hittite codes, the Assyrian codes. The reason why you would do that is to guarantee that slaves are always treated humanely. You cannot physically abuse slaves and get by with it. Tone, you got a question, thought?
Yeah, Tim, this sounded quite foreign to me when I was hearing about it, but even in the Middle Ages, like when I learned in my Vikings class, it's that the Norse actually offered and gave their own slaves their own piece of land, their own sort of chunks of land.
Yeah, yeah. It was an economic situation. It wasn't an enslavement in the sense that we think of slavery now. Yes. Let's move on, Shay. I mean, are you guys kind of seeing how this all ladders back up to, it keeps laddering back up to, you shouldn't kill, you shouldn't covet, you shouldn't, these ideas of what's being driven. Then we get into a whole lot of farm stuff. If you've got oxen that gore people, there's a whole lot of language about that. Or if you don't cover up a pit and somebody falls in it, or an animal falls in it, if the oxen gores somebody, then it wasn't because it had never done it before, then you're not responsible for the person, even if you have to kill the oxen. It's just like in today's thing. If your dog, you lose control of your dog and your dog hurts somebody, you got to put the dog down. You got to put the oxen down. But if the oxen has gored and killed someone before and you didn't do that, and the oxen gores somebody again, now you have to pay. You have to pay. You should be put down because you're not a responsible owner. You're a threat to the community. There are the same thing with pits. If you didn't cover up your pit and somebody falls in, there are damages that have to be paid. However, if you steal, I love this. If you steal, what happens is you got to pay in double. You have to pay in triplicates. If you steal an ox, you got to pay back 5 oxen. If you steal a sheep, you got to pay 4 sheep. It takes longer to get an ox grow. It costs a lot more money, so the penalty is a little higher. There are all these wonderful little ways that all of this gets weighed out. And then there's this interesting thing in all of this theft talk about that if you wake up and you catch someone in the night breaking into your house, because you can't see who they are and what they're doing, and if they've got a weapon, you're entitled to stand your ground in the house and kill that person. But if they come in the day and you kill them, then you get killed because that was manslaughter. It's very interesting the way that works, because you can see that whether or not they've got a weapon. It's just these interesting little subtleties in the way these laws play out. There are laws about safekeeping of property. If you hold on to it and you lose it, you're responsible for paying it back. If somebody steals it, then you can say somebody stole it, but at some point you got to get in court and testify, and the court has to decide whether or not you're telling the truth. You get into idolatrous customs, because they say this is where they're looking at other cultures around them. If a man seduces a virgin, he has to pay the bride price for her. Now, this is one of the ways that we know that this text comes much later, because this idea of the bride price, what we call the dowry in later culture, that's a much later idea. So they're talking about bride price as if this thing just came down off the mountain with Moses, and it's a much later idea. It's one of those anachronisms. And so, but the bride price would have to be paid whether or not the dad lets you marry the daughter. So the dad could say, all right, you seduced or you raped my daughter, you have to pay the bride price, and okay, you can marry her. But he might say, not a chance are you ever going to marry her. I don't want you anywhere near my family. I don't want anything to do with you. You still have to pay the bride price. So that's either way. That keeps everybody zipped up. Then what you got is there are other things that are just big old no-nos, capital offenses, practicing witchcraft. Now, why would that be? Today we've got a lot of people who are into a lot of things. The problem with witchcraft, and it is witches, it calls out women, is because women are seen to be seductive, and they can lead people into believing and doing things that are painful for the cult, that they create conflict in the culture. So witchcraft, bestiality, sacrificing to other gods, they say just destroy the folks that do that. We don't have time for this. And that's kind of a very severe thing to our mind. But in those days, there was all of this stuff that had to be managed. Tony, yep.
Yeah, actually, Tim, I remember talking about skinwalkers and how, they were seen as harmful, who could easily, connect to people and steal their spirits and your souls among the Navajo. But I was watching a review of the more recent Mulan remake, and the woman who was of Han Chinese origin, who lives in Canada, her name is Jiran J. Zhao, and she wrote a few books, but she said that it was kind of odd to her because the Han Chinese just don't have witches. I mean, she said that witch was such a charged term and evokes such a specific idea that it's kind of confusing when you use it in the context of the Han Chinese folklore. And she said that there are soothsayers and shamanists, but the thing with soothsayers is that those women were heavily respected in the imperial court.
Yeah.
So, and it was no crime for throughout ancient China for being like a woman and that could do magic. There was no crime for that. There was never considered a crime.
The interesting thing,
the
interesting thing in the fear of witchcraft in Israelite culture goes back to it's different than prophetesses, right? Or women seers, women who have amazing sort of seerage kind of gifts. Witchcraft is always about manipulating the elements, right? It's about potions and it's about doing things with different kinds of stones and rocks. It's that kind of stuff. And if you go back to what we've been saying from the beginning, in the God of Israel is elemental. You don't mess with that stuff. You don't do that kind of stuff. And so that's kind of where that whole, I don't want to say hatred, but it's probably the best word I've got right now in my head. This idea of getting out and going on. Mary, we'll see you. Good night. Travel safely. And then we get out of that gory, weird stuff to the wonderful stuff that I love that reflects the idea of what this whole ethical community is about, right? It is about caring for the poor and the needy. So there are indictments against oppressing immigrants, about mistreating orphans and widows, saying that you will meet ruin. You have to deal fairly with the poor. When you're dealing with them, you have to give them money, loan them money without interest. You can't hold on to any collateral they might give you for the loan too long. If the scripture says if a poor person gives you his coat, you can't hold on to the coat after nightfall. Even if he hasn't repaid the loan, you've got to take the coat back to him because that may be what he uses to keep warm at night. This is a very different idea about collateral, about dealing with the poor. It's not that you get a good interest rate. There is no interest rate if you are loaning money to the poor. You're giving it to them for use with the full expectation it will be paid back. And in the process, you are not gouging or profiting from their stuff. Tony, you had something else, or is your hand still up from the last one? You there? Oh, okay. Let's move on. We're coming to the end of this. So then you get to this idea of reverencing God and leadership. You can't curse God. You can't curse your leaders. And then God starts getting into this weirdness about you're going to have to bring me the first fruits from your vineyards. He also says, give me your oldest son. And everybody reads that and goes, oh my God. And immediately we flash on the story of Abraham and Isaac. That's not how that was ever understood. It is that the oldest son is ransom, that you give a special offering to God, to the temple, when you have your first son. The same thing is true with your oxen and your sheep, although you bring them and give the firstborn of the oxen and the sheep after 7 days, after 8 days, just like you do circumcision on the 8th day. On the 8th day, after you have a newborn oxen, you bring it to the temple. And you have the firstborn of the sheep, you bring it to the temple. Because you are holy to me, God says. And one of the things I love here is like, and by the way, don't eat any meat that's been killed by wild animals. Don't scavenge. Don't go out and grab stuff. You're holy to me. There's a way to do things. And then you get into this wonderful stuff that I love, that I really wish that we were teaching more today. This is going to set off a lot of bells for a lot of us, I think. There's a whole series of quick edicts about just living. You don't get involved in rumoring. You don't contrive with others to mislead folks. You don't get together and say, we'll tell them this and they'll believe that. You don't side with important wrongdoers, even the ones that maybe live in big mansions on the Florida coast. You don't exaggerate to defend them. You don't privilege people that are frivolously litigious. You don't give them the time of day. You don't allow them to muck up the courts. If you see your enemy's donkey and it's lost, you pick it up and you take it back to your enemy. If the donkey is weighted down with too much and has sat down and laid down, you free the donkey of its burden and you get up and you take it and you lead the donkey back to its rightful owner. You don't trivialize justice for the poor in lawsuits. You don't discount what their complaints are and say because they're poor, they don't matter. You don't execute innocent people. You don't take bribes. You don't oppress immigrants. This is what a just society looks like. And it pains me because right now when I think about the state of the world, a lot of this is the exact opposite of what's going on right now, just boldly in front of us. You know, it's like privileging frivolously litigious people. Some of the stuff that we're hearing just coming off of Capitol Hill about arguments about, it's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault. That's like, you don't privilege that. You don't give it the time of day. And then we go into the final set of these categories and we get down to the last piece, which is then we get into, so this is how you're going to live after you've kind of taken care of all of these things that all ladder up to the Decalogue. Now we're going to get back to the Sabbath, and we're going to get back to the top half of this, the relationship with God piece. You farm for 6 years, and then you take a sabbatical. You leave your fields undisturbed the 7th year. You don't plow, you don't plant all over again. The assumption is you've got plenty in your barns. You've been farming for 6 years. You got plenty of, corn. You canned plenty of corn. You got the tomatoes on the shelf. You've taken care of all your stuff. Your groceries are piled up. But poor people who don't own land and wild animals who are not fed at the trough, they get to come and eat for free out of your fields for the entire 7th year. Their needs are still provided for, even during that year whenever you're not intentionally producing anything. In the same way, here comes the Sabbath. Everybody, even the beasts of burden, take a rest because God is resting. And then out of the Sabbath, this commitment, this Sabbath commitment, this understanding that God has privileged you in a way to be like God, calls on you to obey the commands and the desires of God. And it calls on you also to not be calling on any other God. So this gets us back to all of that top half of the Decalogue. And then there's the institution of 3 festivals. There's the festival of the unleavened bread, which becomes known as Passover. There's the festival of the spring harvest, which becomes known as Pentecost. And then there's a festival for the gathering in, which is called Sukkot, or the festival of tabernacles, the festival of booths. We're going to talk a little bit about that on Sunday because it shows up in the text. But there is the gathering in festival was very interesting because that's where everybody, and they do it to this day. I love this. They create booths in their backyards. And during this festival, they live in these booths or these tents. And they do that to remember that they were 40 years in the wilderness and that they were provided for. And they tell the stories of how water came out of rocks, how God brought manna, all the stories of that. That is the gathering in that celebrates the final harvest of the season, where they celebrate and they settle and remember what they've been taken, how they've been taken care of. And then the final command is, and now bring your best. When you come to these festivals, when you come to celebrate, bring your best offering, bring everything that's best about you. How's that? Because in the end, we get this promise. Which is very interesting, coming at the end of these chapters that are written later and kind of inserted, is it sort of pretends like these folks don't know anything about what's going on. Like they don't know who Moses is, because then it ends with this promise. I'm about to send a messenger in front of you to guard you on your way and to bring you to the place I've made ready. I'm going to get you where you need to go. And that's what brings us to the end of this. Any thoughts, surprises, anything perplex you, anything irritate you?
Is that Canaan? Canaan land.
Yes, I'm on my way to Canaan land. Yes. That becomes its own set of problems when they get there, by the way.
I'm minded of a conversation that I've been having with Shay around kind of when covenants go wrong, and you know, kind of thinking back in Scottish and UK history to what was called the National Covenant in 1580, which it historically plays havoc with the rest of the world, because in that document that it takes up the kind of issue of false idolatry, and the National Covenant is an appalling document. It's the document that kind of first refers to the Pope as the Antichrist. It led to 3 civil wars in the United Kingdom. It led to the atrocities in Ireland, and it had a massive influence on the creation of the southern United States.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was saying to Shay is the National Covenant. Scottson and Osterman would sign the covenant in blood.
Oh.
And then they would clean their hands with a handkerchief. And actually, in the southern states, covenant militia would then wear that red handkerchief around their neck, which is where you get the term in southern states of rednecks. They're covenanters.
That's why.
And it's this notion of this for me, what happens when a covenant goes wrong, and also this kind of notion of a covenant being signed in blood, which actually isn't biblical in any kind of sense.
No, there is no signage here. There is, God is coming. God says, here's sort of my thoughts, right? I got these 10 ideas that I really kind of, these are the things that will work for me. Will they work for you? And we're going to see next week, they go up to the mountain and say, yeah, we're in. We're good with this. We'll live this way. And what I love in between is the redactors decided, the editors of the book decided, well, we probably want to let them know that it's not just 10, that when you take those 10 and you begin to apply these principles in very specific cases, that they take on certain forms. And so these themes begin to emerge. But all of them, as we have seen, can become problematic. And if we were to go into Joshua and Judges, we would see how problematic it can become whenever you decide that not having no other gods before Yahweh becomes a problem, becomes the idea that now all of a sudden gets misinterpreted to mean we got to kill everybody who has other gods, that's the problem, right? This is a deal between us. It's not about anybody else, There's a sort of what around here at this house we call sort of like the mean kid idea, right? What it's our four and no more, and we're the clique, and everybody else we got to beat up on. Remember when you're in like 3rd grade, if it was like I got to go beat them up. Why you got to go beat them up? Well, because they're not part of our clique. Did they do anything to you? Well, they're not part of the clique, And you get into that kind of idea, Chris. I think what you're talking about, and when covenants go wrong, it is us to the exclusion of everybody else, and everybody else must pay the price for not being us, which is not at all in this. It's not even in here. It's like, this is the deal I'm making with you all. This is, I have pledged to be your God. This is what I expect in return. These are the behaviors that are pleasing to me. And then you get these 3 chapters of, okay, we've taken these ideas of what works in this covenant, and we've sort of tried to flush them out in terms of what happens if an ox goes crazy and gores somebody. I mean, that's how crazy it sort of gets, right? But that's sort of the way that it is, to take the principles of the law and try to envision the way that those principles are lived out sort of at ground level, without always understanding. It's very important that we all understand this, that what we've just gone through is not statutory law. These are not the laws of Israel. These are the ethical considerations. These are situations that are models. If this happened, this would be the ethical response based on these 10 words that we've been given, this Decalogue. Anything frustrate you? No?
No, the 10 Commandments says the laws are based on that. I mean, not the 10 Commandments, I'm sorry, the Golden Rule.
Yeah?
The laws are based on that.
Love your neighbor as yourself, right? Love God entirely, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on this, Jesus said. And if you
That's
look
what
at,
it is. Yeah.
yeah, if you look at even the stuff we've just gone through, it keeps pointing back to a balanced community where, and I love the way that it really gives prime consideration to the poor and the oppressed, to the widows, to the foreigners. All of that's all wound. This is deeply embedded in the Israelite understanding. To this day, in ethical Judaism, and there is this constant idea, and you hear it all the time, of the mitzvah. You know, the idea of the kind act on behalf of someone who is less fortunate than you, who needs your help. The mitzvah, even if it's somebody may be richer than you, but they may not have the same capability you've got. It's a mitzvah for you to go in and help them. That is so deeply embedded in the Jewish consciousness, the Jewish ethical consciousness, and it comes out of this very idea that these things are set up so that it is a just society. And then we spend the rest of the Hebrew Bible and all of the New Testament and all the rabbis and all of the Christian writers going back, talking about how covenant goes wrong, Chris. How people misuse it, Jesus, I love where Jesus at one point, he's upset at the Pharisees and he says, you know what, you will give yourselves headaches trying to stare down what a gnat's made of, and without looking, you'll just swallow a whole camel, you know? And it's like, you guys are totally missing the point here. In your determination to do put the finest point on what's right, you have thrown the ethics of the community out of whack. That's what
the dangers of needing to be right all the time.
All the time. You know, it's like every now and then it's like, whoa, that didn't catch me.
Do you know, sometimes I would practice being, even though I knew I was right, I let other people be right when it didn't matter.
Yeah.
Just as an exercise in humility.
Yeah.
I would do that.
There is nothing wrong with practicing being wrong, Jeff. I really don't think it's a bad idea.
Only little things. And I'd just be like, okay.
I think it's also we're right at 9, and I'm gonna let y'all go here in a second, but I think it's also what the real premise here is also knowing what is the, you know, pick your battles, right? Some stuff is not worth creating, doing something more harmful for, to try to eliminate that harm. You see what I'm saying? I've been thinking a lot about today, for some reason, in the middle of all this craziness of my day, I was thinking about Jan 6 and 9/11 and how they effectively are the same thing. And then thinking about the oversized response that we had going in and in Afghanistan by the tens of thousands with all of our bombs and everything, looking for one man. And yet we look at what's going on at Jan 6 and we can't even get both parties to align on trying to find out who the culprits are, okay? And that inequity and all of the harm that's being done, trying to just, you know, things get out of scale because it's, to your point, Jeff, I've got to be right. And it's not even I've got to be right anymore in American culture. It's I've got to win. I don't even care if I'm right anymore. I just have to win. And that's a problem for us. That's not new to human nature, though. It's not new to human nature. And these laws are set up to say, look, the slaves matter. You don't get to beat your slaves and put their eyes out and beat the teeth, knock the teeth out of their mouths. That's going to cost you. Even people without rights, their lives have dignity. That's an important kind of premise. It's a powerful kind of premise, but it's also a humbling premise. And we've lost touch with all of that. I was only wrong once when I thought I was wrong, but really I was right. That's funny to me.
Well, that's kind of what I said, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was
But
really
there's something about knowing what to let go, right? Something about saying, you know what, I don't know that Walt and I could have been together for 30 years if we hadn't learned that this fight, and when we fight, the need to win takes over and it escalates, not in terms of violence, but in terms of how ludicrous the argument gets to try to top one another until eventually it just becomes funny. And we discovered this about, it's like, oh yeah, well, if you did this, well, oh yeah, well, you're always doing this. Well, oh yeah, well, if it weren't for you and those stuffed animals that you keep over on that chair, then what's that got to do with anything? Because, well, the sun is like, well, if you just learn to close the blinds, and it just gets nuttier and nuttier and nuttier until we're screaming about something that is not even germane to what started the fight. And then we'll break down and laugh. And now many, many years ago, we learned to get to the point where we knew we were both going to edge into that kind of ludicrousness, where we would stop each other and say, how are you feeling? Do you have a sense of how long this is going to go before one of us laughs? You got a sense how long you think we got to go before we start laughing? And it'd be like, I got a few more things to say. It's okay, go back in, re-engage. But I just was wondering if maybe we could get to the laughter a little sooner. I got some other things I need to do. And so shorthanded. Yeah. But I think anybody that's in a relationship, it's not just a partner, marital, spousal relationship, but in work relationships, in parent-child relationships, learn how, when it's time to let go, it's time to let go. Just let it go. I'm going to do greater harm trying to prevent. My wrong is going to be worse over here trying to be right. And that's really what a lot of these edicts that we see in this text are meant to show us. Your need to prove your power over your slave is not that to the point that you would beat them and disfigure them. Yeah, that's too much. And so the penalty is great. That's sort of the way that this ethic works. The giving slide is up because you all give, and I just want to remind you how to do it. Not that you need a reminder, because I think you all have got like autoplay on your phones now. It just happens, but thank you all for your giving. As we move into the live work, there's stuff that will be happening that's kind of interesting, and we'll see where all of this goes. I'm always reminded that I think I'm steering until I'm not, until Jesus takes the wheel. So that's kind of where we are with that. But I want to thank you all for your faithfulness and your goodness. And next week we will be back. And next week we go up on the mountain and we seal the deal. That's what happens in the study. So next week's lesson is called Picnic, and we'll be there together for that. Meanwhile, we'll see you all on Sunday. I've seen pieces of the service. It's good. I'm sure that you're going to enjoy it. So I look forward to seeing you all virtually in the chat on Sunday. We are also going to wish Marcella a happy birthday this weekend. She's taken off to go see her friends, and so her daughter. She's going to spend time with her daughter. So happy birthday, Marcella. It's lovely. It's lovely that you are with us, and we wish you a happy birthday.
Thank you. I'm only gone for one day, so I'll be back Saturday.
And we'll have you anyhow in our service, even if you're not going to be there live.
Yeah, we got you already.
I had to re-record Waymaker.
Yeah. They did a second version of that, I heard.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So.
But anyway,
but thank you. I'm just tired. I'm tired.
Yeah, me too.
I am
too. Yeah, I know.
Where you at?
We didn't take it personal.
Nobody's taking tired personal. We've already.
It's late by Chris, though.
Yeah.
He
good
seemed like
thing.
he's
You're
wide
good,
awake
Chris.
though.
Yeah, you look
No,
wide
it's
awake.
Look wide.
it's 3 a.m. I'm early, not late.
He does those weird two sleeps things.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What
Yes, you
time is
do.
it there, Chris? What
3
time?
a.m.
I thought you said that. 3 a.m. Oh man. Wow.
I've had my first sleep.
We're
I'm
so
going back for
honored.
my second sleep.
Going for your second.
Sleep.
Chris, we
yeah.
really are holding you in prayer. I want you to know that, and keeping you close in our hearts.
Mhm.
It's just
Yeah.
not a day goes by that I don't pray for you and think about you, and I know that I'm not alone in that. So,
And you're handling this all with considerable grace, Chris.
oh yes,
And
absolutely,
it's really,
absolutely.
I don't know if Fiona would say that, but from where we sit, you're handling it really just with such dignity, and it's a lot you got going on. But
It is what it is.
Yeah. Well, I wish that, and I've said this in prayer actually. You're like, Lord, in a different kind of world, in a different kind of time in the life of the church, there would be send the pastor over to be with Chris for his big surgery and come back home with me like I was going on a vacation. I can't do that, but I'm just praying that you will be surrounded by, well, Fiona and Hazel will be with you, but your other friends that are there will be with you, and we'll all be standing beside you and in spirit. And then maybe it's better that I wait and go whenever you got post-surgery, and we can just kick up all kinds of dirt together. That's what we'll do. How's that?
Well, Fiona just wants them to live stream the surgery.
it's hilarious.
Oh my God! I went to see Rachel last night after her surgery the day before to see how she was doing, and she was just waiting to be discharged. They were waiting to see if all of her bodily functions were working again, as classically happens after a surgery. And so she was waiting for that. And they took a very massive fibroid tumor. They removed that from her. That was what the problem was. And I would only tell you that because they put it on Facebook. But they removed this giant fibroid tumor from her uterus. Thank God they were able to save her uterus, because they were just beginning to talk about family planning. So that was a big deal, but they took it from her. And then she and Sophia look at me and say, "You want to see a picture of it?" And it was like, no, I'm all right. I'm good. That's let me imagine it. I'm sure it's bigger than my imagination. I don't need to see a picture. Thank you. So yeah, so tell Fiona that if you do live stream the surgery, that I'll come in with coffee afterwards. That's what I'll do. I'll just come in and come.
I'm not giving permission for it to be live streamed.
I mean, do they do that? They don't do that.
No. When I had my gallbladder out a few years back, Fiona wanted the gallstones out of my gallbladder, and I refused.
Make cufflinks.
Well, apparently you can turn them into jewelry. Yeah.
Yes. They
Yeah,
do.
I've heard of that.
I
Yeah.
was like, no, you're not having trophies of my body.
There is something rather morbid about that, I think. It would be a one of a kind piece, though.
Well, the Victorians, you could buy antique pins made of hair and jewelry made of hair and of your loved one.
I suggested to Hazel the other day, because I've seen this is now possible, is you can get your body cremated, turned into diamonds, and then gifted to your children.
Oh my Lord.
Hazel was not impressed by that idea.
I've heard of that.
She's not looking, really. Well, there you go.
Carbon.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're making diamonds now.
Oh my goodness. Well, kids, this has just been so good. I know that I did a lot of talking tonight. There was just a lot of these pieces. I wondered, how the heck am I going to cover all this? It's like, just make the lists. Just walk through the lists and kind of give everybody make some sense behind ease some of the pain of reading it. It's just a lot. It gets worse in the other books of Torah. It gets really crazy. But this is kind of the first round to go. It's just lovely to see you all. I'm so spoiled with you all. It's a terrible thing. I just never want to be apart from you. So, but I'm going to say goodnight and God bless you. And we'll see you all Sunday. Have a wonderful weekend. Travel safely, Marcella. Come back to us. Don't be too hard on your daughter. You know how moms get.
I'm not gonna be hard on her because after what we went over tonight, I mean, I talked to her today. There's no chance. So I'm just gonna there's no chance.
Okay.
She's doing it. So. Oh,
There
well.
you go. Well, there you go.
You have a great birthday, Marcella.
I'm like, thank you.
Yeah.
Have a
See you guys
wonderful.
Sunday.
We'll see you Sunday. Love you
Bye,
all.
everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.